Originally given whole talks on chanting. It's a way of really letting the teachings touch into our hearts in a deeper way, without our needing to necessarily have a lot of concept about it all. So, as it turns out, there's a chant that is very appropriate for the talk I want to offer tonight. And so I'm going to attempt, since this is new effort on our part, I'm going to attempt to play some of it at the end of the meditation, so it will kind of guide us out of the meditation. Then I'll ring the bell, and that will be that. And the chant is Buddhist monks who are chanting probably the most familiar Buddhist mantra ever, which is Om Mani Padme Hum. And it means, there are a lot of different translations, but it means something like, it's all okay. It means that the jewel, literally translated, the jewel is in the heart of the lotus, meaning that this lotus, this incredible blossom, grows up through the muck, through the darkness, through the dirt, through the cloudy water, through the bugs, and then there's this incredible flower. And so it's sort of reminding us of who we really are, in its fundamental form. So we'll take a stab at offering that chant at the beginning, and hopefully we'll maybe include a little bit at the end as well, after I explain how it is actually related to the theme of the evening. So it's all okay. Coming to be here. Whatever we bring, whatever the state of the mind is or the body, as we begin the meditation, we tune our awareness to simply knowing this, whatever our struggles, confusions, mistakes, brilliance. Here we are. Knowing ourselves sitting here, simply being. Feeling the earth that is our mother, that is supporting us, that we can relax, rest, just be. Perhaps touching into any quality of gladness from the day. Just a moment that arose during the day where you were glad. And feeling that in the body. And then allowing awareness to find a way of focusing, maybe on the breath. Or perhaps body sensations or hearing, but selecting a focus, maybe the breath, and simply resting awareness there, knowing this body breathing. In, out. The sensations of the breath, just this. Just this. You are welcome to join in if you want, or you're also welcome to just receive the sound into your mind and heart and body, whatever feels right for you. That is perhaps the most sacred mantra in all of the Buddhist tradition. It is the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, who is the protector of compassion, he, she who hears the cries and responds to the cries of the world. And it is said that the sounds of that mantra are, in fact, the sound of compassion. It's what compassion sounds like. And so as we offer and engage with that chanting, we are actually opening ourselves to both request the guidance and the compassion and the response of Avalokiteshvara to the suffering of ourselves and also of the world, and also cultivating the mind and heart that offers that quality of compassion to all beings. So we'll talk a little bit more about compassion in relation to wise speech tonight as we offer the talk. I thought to speak tonight on speaking, on wise speaking, on using words. I thought it might be timely for us all. Maybe as I begin, you might contemplate for a moment, or just reflect for a moment, maybe a moment when your speech wasn't so wise, if you have any of those. Perhaps sometimes in the public sphere these days, with respect to the news, sometimes our speech, and maybe even we could include listening in that. Our listening might not be so wise, or a relationship, our speech might not be so wise, or perhaps even speaking to ourselves. So just reflect for a moment on a moment in time when your speech might not have been so wise, according to whatever standard you have. And let yourself notice what that feels like in your body. Just to notice that. So we'll explore a little bit working with that tonight. I want to talk a bit about some of the traditional teachings about wise speech, the Buddhist teachings on wise speech. And then I want to notice a bit or expand a bit on a real crucial dimension of the teaching that I think often gets somewhat overlooked. And then we'll have a few moments to practice contemplating either with, by yourself or with another person, to think, okay, how does this really work? Or how might it work for me? Especially if I bring in this other dimension that's really the heart of it, the crucial piece of it. It can be really difficult sometimes to sort out what's wholesome speaking, what's wholesome listening. I remember a situation not too long ago where I did finally speak, but I prefaced it by saying, I don't know whether or not to say this. As I had contemplated, it was just like I just couldn't. I sort of came to, I think speaking is better than not speaking, but I really am not sure, So that speaking and even listening, do we listen to the news? Do we listen do we read everything that's available to us? Even that can be a bit of a dilemma. The traditional teachings, right speech explained in negative terms, means avoiding four types of harmful speech: lies, words spoken with the intent of misrepresenting the truth, so lies; divisive speech, spoken with the intent of creating rifts between people; harsh speech, spoken with the intent of hurting another person's feelings; and idle chatter, spoken with no purposeful intent at all, other than perhaps filling up space. And the Buddha's actual words, he said, "Monks, a statement endowed with 5 factors is well spoken, not ill spoken. It is blameless and unfaulted by knowledgeable people." Which 5 factors? He says, it is spoken at the right time. It is spoken in truth. It is spoken with affection. It is spoken beneficially, and it is spoken with a mind of goodwill. But still we ponder in any given situation, what is wise speech with our children, with our parents, with our relatives, with our family, with the technical support, our airline reservation person, with that contractor who didn't finish the work. And when reading the news or listening to podcasts or watching TV comedians. I've actually noticed, sometimes what passes as TV comedy is actually quite troublesome speech sometimes to listen to. When and where and how is silence wise speech? And what is wise speech when we are speaking to ourselves in those inner monologues we know so well? How do we discern what is wise and what is wholesome? And Alan Wallace had a quote that I put in here because it just seems so relevant. He said, he's not talking about speech in particular, he's talking about our whole practice. He says, we begin with a vision of the nature of the practice, what the point of the practice is, what it is designed to yield or bring forth. Bring to mind, he suggests, some image. It is helpful to have a vision of what human flourishing and happiness is about. What does your own human flourishing entail? What does your own human flourishing entail? Holding the vision, we bring forth a well-wishing for ourselves, that we may cultivate these qualities through the practice. May we thrive and prosper in this. May our practice yield the fruits for which it was designed, and yield our own well-being, both in solitude and in relationship to others. Let us inspire ourselves to engage in the practice so those fruits may be realized. Sometimes we forget that kind of guidance in the practice especially when we listen to the precepts or we read about the precepts that speak to wise speech. They can kind of be like, do this, don't do that. Just rules for, mismanners or something like that, good behavior. But to remember, what Alan Wallace is pointing us to, the vision of the practice, it's really what brings you here tonight. None of you came here tonight to kind of get, a refrigerator magnet that said do this or do that. That if you touch into your own intention about being here, it really is more along the lines of what Alan is talking about, is there's something about human flourishing or freedom from suffering or happiness that draws you to the practice and to spending this evening here when there are so many other things you could be doing. So wise speech in the context of this, the wholesomeness of our practice, it can get lost a little bit. The teachings of the Buddha in the suttas, the teachings of the Buddha around wise speech can sound very kind of cut and dry. Many of you know the story of Prince Abhaya, and where the Buddha was speaking about what is wise speech, and it grew out of actually a rift in the community, in which the Buddha's cousin Devadatta had, over long years of practice, had actually become quite skilled and adept. He had, it said, really pretty amazing psychic powers. He had gathered his own kind of community of monks who really appreciated and respected his teachings. And it's said that he also got rather full of himself in that regard, that he really kind of became rather attached to his own views and his own way of teaching, and began to create some kind of schisms, if you will, in the community, basically saying to people, don't follow the awakened one, follow me, because one of the tenets that he said the Buddha's gotten really soft. He's done this middle way stuff, and he lets people live in monasteries, and really, monks, you should be living out under a tree in the woods, because that's a really more strict ascetic practice, and you shouldn't be allowing yourself to receive new robes, that you should only wear patched old robes, because new robes are really too kind of ascetic, they're not ascetic, you're really being kind of indulgent. And so the schism was really around a couple of things. It was around Devadatta's view that the Buddha had gotten soft, and that really, if one really was a diligent practitioner, that you really had to be much more upright and rigid. And then the other piece is, it is said, that he had also gotten rather full of himself and really enamored, if you will, of the following that he was gathering around himself. It's really interesting to read the stories, because there also are some stories that said that Devadatta had tried to kill the Buddha a number of times. The Buddha's cousin had tried to kill him, that he was so angry with him and so determined to take over the community. And as I was preparing this talk, I realized that there is actually some kind of deeper investigation that suggests that those stories that paint Devadatta in the extreme of being like an evildoer were actually generated several centuries after the Buddha in the interest of dividing the community. And in the interest of saying that because apparently Devadatta's followers had actually continued to kind of hold, this particular segment of the community, and then the Buddhist followers had continued to hold this segment, and the Buddhist followers became politically more powerful, and then they began to kind of paint Devadatta in a more negative light. So anyway, so it's just really interesting that the teachings about wise speech come because it is said that some of the followers of Devadatta had actually tried to trick the Buddha. At one point the Buddha did say, in the sutras it says, the Buddha actually called Devadatta out and told him that if he continued being kind of pompous and trying to divide people against one another, that he would be reborn in a hell realm. And that he said that publicly to Devadatta. And so then they tried to kind of trick the Buddha and say, well, you're not really, that's not really wise speech, because you're really saying something that's pretty advised to someone that's not really kind. And so they sent someone to the Buddha to ask him about it, figuring that no matter what he said, he would prove himself wrong. Because if he said you shouldn't do that, then you say, well, yeah, but you did. And if he said you should, then what is this teaching about wise speech? And, it struck me as I was reading this story as like, the Buddha lived in times like ours, It's just like, does that sound familiar? With, people kind of saying one thing's true and it's not really true, it didn't really happen that way, and, trying to create divisions and, I'm right and you're wrong. And so it's so interesting because we can tend to think of, the Buddhist time or the Buddhist teachings as in a very different context than ours. And really, this whole teaching about wise speech came up in very similar circumstances. And the Buddha's response, about wise speech, he said there's no one-sided answer about wise speech. He said you have to contemplate. I'll give you some guidelines, but you have to contemplate. And then there's another piece I'm going to add that he added at the end, which I think is crucial. But basically, he said, words that are true, that are correct, I take that to mean more or less timely, and beneficial. Those are the three kind of givens of wise speech: true, correct, beneficial. And then he said, whether or not it's welcome or agreeable to another person, I have to contemplate, because that really isn't the criterion about whether or not you speak. But even if it's unwelcome and disagreeable, one still needs to kind of consider whether or not it's appropriate speech. And then he adds at the very end a piece that I think gets overlooked in the teaching on wise speech. And he said, I really offer wise speech for the welfare of all beings. And he said, why is that? Because I have compassion for all beings. So that the teaching on wise speech is embedded in this sense of the guidance really comes out of compassion, and compassion along the lines of what Alan is talking about with the ending of suffering. Well-being, wholeness, goodness. So that to have all of our speech guided by compassion for suffering, our own and others, is really the heart of the teaching on wise speech. And again, sometimes I think, maybe it's just me, but I think I can get kind of caught up in some kind of rule-based thinking about, this, do this and don't do that, when really the contemplation is around, is my speech guided by compassion for all beings? Is my listening guided by compassion for all beings? A little aside, we may or may not get to it at the end, but the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, I've heard many teachers speak of using that when they hear of news that is difficult or challenging, when there's news of a tornado, Om Mani Padme Hum. When there's news of flooding in Venice, Om Mani Padme Hum. When there's news of a friend of ours today who went back in the hospital because to correct a problem with some surgery, Om Mani Padme Hum. That the offering of compassion and care for suffering, for a politician who is clearly struggling and suffering, Om Mani Padme Hum. Can whatever the speech is be embedded in this larger frame of compassion and care and the intent to end suffering for all beings, which, by the way, includes ourselves. I asked you at the beginning to touch into what it feels like to not speak in a wholesome way. And there's suffering, isn't there? There's, Om Mani Padme Hum. There's suffering in that. May I be free from suffering. May I be free from suffering. And indeed, unless we actually can offer that kind of compassion to ourselves with our own speech, we're probably not going to be able to offer it well for other people, because we're going to think that that person doesn't speak wisely, but I always do. But we know what it's like to be caught in the suffering of unwise speech toward ourselves, toward one another. We know what it's like. We know what it's like. So that any compassion that we experience toward the other person isn't some kind of self-righteous or pitying kind of sense, but just like, hey, I get it. I know what it's like, Every once in a while, I'll be in a situation, God knows how I happen to be there, where someone will put a microphone in my face, a news reporter will put a microphone in my face and want my views about something, and my heart stops, and I use that as an excuse to not respond. But that somebody who's having to speak, to the news and say something wise and doesn't do that very well, Om Mani Padme Hum, So to really kind of consider the kind of larger spaciousness, in another sutta, the Buddha says, suppose a man came with a blazing grass torch and said, I shall heat up the river Ganges with this torch. What do you think, bhikkhus, monks? What do you think, monks? Could that man heat up and burn away the river Ganges with this blazing grass torch? No, venerable sir. Why is that? Because the river Ganges is deep and immense. It is not easy to heat it up or burn it away with a blazing grass torch. Eventually the man would reap only weariness and disappointment. And so what he goes on in the sutta to say, in the same way, we should cultivate a heart of compassion and loving kindness, so that when these situations arise, the decision, the contemplation is actually made in the larger context. And so that, he says, we should cultivate, we should practice such that no matter what happens, we're not pulled into reactivity. But rather than having it be like, well, if I'm a good person, I won't be pulled into reactivity, really the practice is in the practice of cultivating kindness and compassion, beginning with ourselves, so that when these moments arise, the river Ganges is there, the larger spaciousness is there in which we can offer and hold whatever it is that's arising, and actually hold the discernment that is required for us to decide what to do, whether or not to speak. So I thought it might be useful for you to just contemplate a little bit. I'm going to pass out a couple of the quotes that I've read to you are on this page, and also at the very bottom are the Buddha's teachings on wise speech. So let me hand these out to you. Thank you. And if you want to do this with another person, it often is useful, I find it useful to inquire with someone else, because the very place that I get caught is the very place that I get caught, and that somebody else's view can often be very, very helpful. So I'm going to ask you to contemplate. Now, we could contemplate wise speech with respect to the political sphere. you know, something that's true. Can I have one of them? Thanks. Here, Bill. So at the very bottom, a statement endowed with 5 factors is well-spoken, not ill-spoken. It is blameless and unfaulted by knowledgeable people. Which 5? It's spoken at the right time, spoken in truth, spoken affectionately, spoken beneficially, and spoken with a mind of goodwill. Now, you may decide that you want to contemplate with respect to the political news sphere, public. You may want to contemplate with respect to a specific situation in relationship that you find yourself in. Here's what I'm going to suggest, if you feel so inclined, that you contemplate with respect, at least for starters, with respect to how you speak to yourself.